Hey there, how's it going, folks? For anybody new listening in, anybody catching this video for the first time, there are a couple videos before this one that you might want to listen to. If you haven't listened to them, you haven't checked them out, simply just go down here to the little link underneath the channel there. It shows Take on the World TV, and you can easily find the video that we did before this one and the one before that. So I would suggest, at the very least, the one before this. The rock tumbler, and it helps a little bit to understand the direction of where these videos are going and the overall sentiment if you check out the Rise Up and Build video that comes before that. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and play the intro.
Yeah, wait, he's alive. He's alive. Yeah, wait, look. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Yahweh.
Okay, I love that song. For anybody who doesn't know, that song was actually written for me for my ministries 4 years ago by a friend who also does hip hop music. And no, it wasn't Jeremiah Dirt. As you can tell, the voice was different. But he is somebody I'd like to bring on the show at some point to talk about things that the Father leads him to do. But anyhow, I love that song. We got to change the video, but I love that song. Okay, so how are you guys doing? In the last week's video, I think it was the most interactive video I've ever been a part of, either by myself or with others, with the chat. I loved the interaction. There was so much going on. It seemed, from what I can tell by the chat, that a lot of people listening in, at least live, that it was a word in due season for them, and that really encourages me to keep moving forward in what I hear what I believe I hear the Father telling me to do, because this video and the two before are not videos I necessarily had in mind to do, so that was just really neat. So I'm really hoping that the chat interacts again tonight. If you have comments and thoughts and things to add or disagree with or whatever, I'd love to see that. Okay, so I do not have as many pages of notes for tonight's video as I did last video. And I was telling my wife, I said, I think tonight is going to be short, but I said that last week too. And last week was not short. So I guess we'll see how the Spirit leads. Yes, interacting, Karina, please. I hope there is interaction. Okay, so the topic is polished stones. Without getting into it, if you did miss last video, just to kind of catch you up, although I would strongly suggest just going back and listening to that video first, we were discussing the scriptural understanding that the body of believers is made up of many different members with many different gifts and roles and purposes and spiritual offices. And we talked about spiritual seasons and how things might change from time to time. There might be certain gifts and things that you're led to do differently during one season than the other, and how it might operate differently for you on what you're being led as somebody else. And we were talking about the body coming together and recognizing your own gifts and others' gifts, and how to seek the community on what your gifts are so that you can help build, to rise up and build with the body. First we said rise up and build, and then the second video was, do you know what you're called to do? Because if you're going to come and contribute to the body, you're going to need to know what you can bring to the table, what the Father is leading you to do and wants to do through you. So in lieu of that, going in line, tonight we're going to talk about the topic as polished stones, right? Polished stones. And we were hinting at the last video that when believers come together, even though there's disagreements in beliefs or understandings and principles and things like this, that much like rocks put in a rock tumbler, there's some tumbling sometimes involved in that fellowship, right? Things aren't always real smooth when you're discussing things that you disagree on, especially if you have built upon that belief of yours many layers of beliefs that are contingent upon that stone, if you will. And if somebody else that you're fellowshipping with comes along and just kind of wants to knock it all over and say, no, this is all wrong, there's some tumbling in that at times. But if we embrace the tumbling and we allow the Father to guide us in our understanding and how to perceive it, sometimes we can come out looking like polished stones of a rock tumbler. And that maybe instead of trying to avoid tumbling in fellowship, that we should embrace it. Okay, so polished stones. Tonight I want to start with Ephesians 4, which is a portion of scripture that I had mentioned in the last video, which is good for both of these videos, considering this is just a continual, it's part 2. So Ephesians 4, if you go down to verse 2 there, it's talking about with lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love, right? And the very first verse actually says, Paul saying, I beseech that you walk in the worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, right? Vocation and calling. What you're called to do, that you work through that with loneliness and meekness, not allowing ego and pride and things of this nature to swell up and puff up, with long suffering, right? And we could look at all the different spiritual offices and gifts and talents and find how long suffering is a part of that. If you're doing street ministries, there's going to be some long suffering with individuals coming and confronting you and wanting to ask questions or cause problems, right? I did street preaching for a little bit, and if you get out there with a mic or without a mic, what have you, if you're trying to preach on the corners of streets, it can draw the attention of individuals that you might not expect if you're not familiar with that. But long suffering, I mean, whether you're teaching or preaching or whatever it is you're being led in the body, long suffering is going to be a huge part of that. And I mean, that should be expected. You're trying to work with others. You're either trying to teach or preach to others. You're trying to encourage others. Whatever it is, you're working with others. And when you work with others, whether or not they're receptive, whether or not they're interested, what have you, there's going to be some tumbling, right? So therefore, some long suffering. Forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's one body, one Spirit, as you're called in one hope of your calling, right? And if you keep going down, talks about grace is given us to the measure of the gift of Christ, the Messiah, and gave gifts unto men. And okay, so real quick, I wasn't planning on going into this, but since I'm seeing it, let's do it. I did it in the original video in 2017. So it says in verse 11 here, he gave some apostles, some prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, right? This is often called the 5-finger fold, right? Because there's 5 of them. And the idea is that with the 5, you have a full hand, right? And we discussed last week that those would be your 5 main, but there are quite possibly, arguably, other roles and offices and things like that that do not fall in those 5. I mean, scripture alone tells you that there's deacons and bishops and elders, and there's certain rules, like when you're looking at Timothy's and things, that talks about which one, how to look for individuals that should be bishops and deacons and elders and things of this. And there's sometimes guidelines and instructions that are specific to those offices, right? So you don't want to stick to just those 5 if you're looking at all the different things. There's a lot to the picture, I believe. But for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body. So he's talking about this is the reason why we were given 5 different of the main folds there. For the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edification of the body, until we come into unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Messiah, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, right? And I'm going to stop it there for that portion of scripture. I wanted to hone in on those verses. Number 1, I don't know if anybody listening to this video is going to have an issue with me saying this, but usually when I say this, there is some conflict, and that's okay. We can have some tumbling. But I find it interesting that there are those who believe that the 5-finger fold, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, pastors, teachers, that this was done away with Specifically, usually when people believe that, they point to apostles and prophets, and they look at verses that say things like, John was until the law and the prophets, right? So they look at verses like that, and in my opinion, they would cut it out of context and just solely focus on just that one verse. And they would see it as, see, we no longer have apostles, we no longer have prophets. But if that is a belief that you are particularly holding on to, I want to bring to your attention something to think about, if you haven't already, that this is being written by Paul after the ascension of the Messiah, and that there is mention of apostles and prophets and prophetesses, female prophets, after the ascension of the Messiah. If you go through the book of Acts, you will find verses talking about prophets. So there's that. But more so important than that, I wanted to go into how we're seeing the diversity of the body that we discussed about in 1 Corinthians 12 and 14 and Romans 12. And here in Ephesians 4, we're seeing that it is for the perfecting of the saints. So it's for the edification of the body. There is varying and diversification. We have diverse members with different roles and gifts and things so that we can come together, so that God can work on us with our walk individually, but also work on us and each other through each other. He's a very active God. He loves to have that private connection with us, but he also loves to work through us to others, which is one of the main points we were bringing up in last week's video, was that if you're struggling on identifying and discerning gifts and roles and offices that the Father has for you, I would suggest going and putting your gifts to work. And you said, but I don't know what the gifts are. Well, just go be with the body and ask the Spirit to guide you and see what comes out, and see what the community tells you that they see God doing through you. Your gifts are meant for others. It's a gift given to you that you didn't earn. You received as a gift, right? But it's meant for others, not just you. Christ forms himself in you for the sake of others. And that's a sentence, when I first came across this, that I don't know about that. So I had to go and pray on it and study on it and things like this. Mind you, this was 4 years ago. And I came to the conclusion that that is an actual accurate statement, that he does it not just for you, but for the sake of others. And here we have in Ephesians 4 saying the same thing, that it is for the work of the ministry, which is to reach, but also to edify within. It's not just about reaching outside the boundary of body. So many self-identified believers, and I believe personally, this is me personally speaking, personally I think that it's part of an indoctrination that we have in our churches. And I'm not bashing churches. I'm not saying that if you have a congregation or whatever, that it's not of God. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that churches, right, because we are supposed to be the church. We are the ecclesia, right? But congregations, what have you, from what I can gather, from what I've seen in my experience and growing up, typically have this understanding that, okay, we need you to believe that the Messiah came, was of God, died on the cross for your sins, that your salvation is not earned but received as atonement for your sin, and then you're good to go, right? And then you get there, whether it's genuine or not, right? Some of them just have you repeat a couple sentences and they say, now you're saved, and I have a problem with that personally. But they get you there, right? Genuinely or not, and they say, okay, now it's your turn to go get others. And I have some problems with that. And I'm not saying that all congregations do this. I'm not saying that that's always the case. You know, if you have a yes, thus thinketh Ian. That's right, Chad. That was one of my favorite things that Rob used to say, was this is not thus saith the Lord, it's thus thinketh Rob. I loved that he said that, because it was such a neat and personable way to relate and get the sentiment across of, this is what I think. I'm not saying 100%, this is how it seems to me. And I'm constantly trying to do that. I'm trying to make sure that you understand that I'm not trying to claim something that I don't feel 100% comfortable in saying, absolutely. It's just, this is where I'm at now. This is what I see now. Take it, for what it's worth. And if you think maybe not, go to the Father and see what he tells you. Yes, thus thinketh Ian. Okay, but I would argue that in that verse there, in verse 13 of Ephesians 4, it says, until we come to the unity of the faith and knowledge of the Son of God unto a perfect man, into the fullness of the Messiah. I would say as a body, we have not reached that point yet, which would further support my personal understanding that that five-finger fold has not been done away with, that there are still prophets and apostles, as well as teachers and preachers. I always find it interesting in evangelists that usually those three are not an issue. People don't question whether or not we have evangelists, pastors, and teachers. They just question the apostle and prophets. Even though you have Paul saying he was an apostle after the ascension. Anyhow, we're not going to get into the whole before and after ascension and dispensationalism and what I disagree with their understandings on that and Paul and things of that. I mean, we're going to bring up a couple things, but I'm not getting deep into that topic. That's not what this video is for. Okay, so vocation, calling, diversification for what? For the work of the ministry, but also for the edification of the body. So many times believers feel that their gifts are literally meant to just go out and reach the unbeliever, right? Maybe you call them the Gentile, maybe you don't. There's different understandings on the definition of those words. Again, not going into that tonight. But it seems to be this understanding of, you know, the ministry of God is to reach the lost souls. And I'm not saying that's not part of it. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that's not the whole picture. That's why we see so many different ministries on so many different puzzle pieces, right? Okay. All right, so I have some excerpts from another book that if you listen to last week's video, and if you're going to look at that book that I mentioned last week, I would strongly recommend and suggest that if you're going to go get that book, that you would pair it with this book. See if I can... Okay, yeah, see, there's no gloss on that, so that's nice. This is the one I have. It's a revised version. It's called Invitation to a Journey by M. Robert Mulholland Jr. But yeah, I have a expanded version by Ruth Haley Barton. To be honest, her commentary that she added, I did not find helpful. I didn't find it helpful the first time I read it, nor the second time when I looked at it years later. And again, a couple nights ago when I was going back through this to prepare for tonight's video, still didn't get anything out of her commentary. I'm not saying that you won't. I'm just saying maybe the original version is just as good. So I wouldn't be worried about making sure you have the expanded or revised version or what have you. But Invitation to a Journey. This book definitely pairs well with the last book from last week, which was Courage and Calling, something like that. Yeah, it was right side up. Yep, leave it to Karina to get that in there. It's tough to be a part of a church when they practice Christian yoga, offering vaccines, and celebrating Halloween. Oh, Halloween. Fitting. Yeah. Should we talk about that for a minute? Okay, so in many churches, being buildings where there are congregations and there is administration and things of that nature, there are pros and cons. Pros are you have the chance to be in fellowship with others. Maybe you don't necessarily agree with them theologically on everything, but this is something I tend to say often, even with my closest friends that I love, that I see as brothers and sisters in the faith, whose input and perspective I hold in high regards without having respective persons. Even those individuals I disagree with on a number of things. There is not one person I can think of that I agree with 100% on everything all the time. The closest one, personally for me, is my wife. We came into the faith at the exact same moment. We had the exact same spiritual encounter. Simultaneously, separately, simultaneously. That's a really neat story, and I should probably share that on here at some point. But since that moment, we've been together for the most part in our walk, moving together and receiving a lot of the same revelation. So there's very, very little that her and I disagree on. But even then, there's a couple things. There's a couple verses that her and I do not agree on specific details. And these aren't big foundational stones. These are not what we would consider salvational issues, but there's still some disagreement. So that's going to happen when you visit churches, when you're part of churches. I'm sure this is not foreign or new to many, if at all any of you, but it's something that should be said out loud. This is something that should be discussed in fellowship. There's going to be things. Now, I'm not justifying so-called Christian yoga, and I'm not justifying one of the other words that was in that comment that I do not want to be used to shut down this video and or channel. And I'm not justifying traditions of man, such as so-called holidays, right? And there's a lot of ministries that do a really good job in discussing whether or not believers should be involved in those holidays. You can go ahead and put some in the comments or in the chat here if you know of some. I think 119 Ministries did a series on that. I know Jim Staley, he had at least one big video and probably did multiple videos on the topics of truth or tradition, wasn't it called something like that? And he really got into it and brought out details and the history and showed some pretty cool things with that. So if that's something that's new to you, or if you're not new to that, but you haven't seen those yet and you want to discuss that with others, lovingly, gently, maybe mentioning those would be good. But yeah, it is. It's tough to be a part of a church, right? When you have issues like that, right? There's all kinds of things. Like my household, personally, we do not do any of the what we consider to be worldly holidays. So Xmas, Easter, Lent, New Year's Day, Valentine's Day, Halloween. We don't do any of those. And I'm not here to try to, if any of you listening to this live or later are observing those things, I'm not trying to state that you must stop. My advice would be you go to the Father. And if you are open and receptive and willing to change some things, alter some things, put some things down, if he shows and tells you to do so, then this is a topic that you should bring to his attention. Because many, such as like myself, have had that experience where they felt that the Father said, we're done with those things, and we're going to replace it with the things that I had brought to the body originally in scriptures. And if you're not on that journey, it is an amazing journey. It may seem hard to let go of some of those things. For me personally, it wasn't, but I know for many, this is a divider, right? In fact, I know multiple households where husband and wife, mom and dad with children, which makes things even harder. One is done with it and the other is not. And this can cause some serious troubles and division in the household. And the more butting of heads year in and year out with that, the more there can be some issues. And I'm not saying that tumbling isn't always good. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there are many pieces to the puzzle. There are many gems, many stones to lay on the foundation. And if you have some that you want to work on with your family, spouse, children, parents, close ones, friends, coworkers, whatever, that you seek the Father, asking for the guidance of the Spirit of when and how to go about things, because what you feel like is needed for that other person might not be what they actually need to hear in the season of their walk. And you might be able to avoid some troubles that would be unnecessary if it wasn't a timely message. Okay. I wanted to see if anybody said anything else about the whole church thing. So there's a lot of members in the body that are split on that topic of whether or not we should be involved in churches, whether or not you're going to be able to be used by the Father to reach people in that congregation, or if the influence is going to be the other way around. And instead of being able to reach people, it's just a constant tool for the enemy to poke at you and attack you and things like this. Again, my personal answer, and this is not cutting around the corner, this is not beating around the bush, this is how I feel on this. And if any of you For those of you who are used to my videos, yes, parallel parenting. Yes, Gary, that's another huge thing. Not just when mom and dad, husband and wife in the house, but when you have, when the household has been split, there's all kinds of struggles now with that relationship and that household and that makeup and things. And now you throw in these beliefs in there too. Yeah, man, I know of a lot of individuals who struggle with that, and it is not an easy thing. My heart goes out to you guys on that. And, 7 to 8 years ago, I was the type that was like, it doesn't matter. This is truth. You stand on it and you are firm on it. But also I didn't have children then. I wasn't and still am not in a divorce situation. There is no split household with me where I have an ex-wife who, there can be some problems there. It's so much easier to point fingers at somebody else and say, you should do this, you should do that, when you're not even in that situation yourself, when you can't relate to it, right? It's easy for the flesh to want to do that. But this is one of the reasons why I say, instead of trying to point out to others, and instead of being so hard pressed on yourself on figuring out, how do I get everything 100% perfect? How do I get the right dates? How do I get the right pronunciations? How do I convince my children, my parents, my wife, my husband, my whatever? How do I convince them this is 100%? And we got to start using this version. We got to start saying this name, and we got to start doing these holy days and not these holidays. And it goes and goes and goes and goes. And there's so many things, right? Are you seeking the Father for the guidance of the Spirit on what to do and how to go about it? Because his ways are not always your ways. And if we are not seeking his guidance on what to say, when to say it, how to go about it, then are we not quite possibly, and I would argue more than likely, leaning on our own understanding? And I know some might think, even right now, possibly thinking, yes, but I know that this is truth. And you might be right about that. But if you're assuming that you know how God would want you to handle it without seeking the Father on it, is that not leaning on your own understanding? There's a lot of scriptures that we can look at that show a cut, drawing the line. Either you're on this line or you're not. But I think there are some factors in those contexts that are often conveniently dismissed or negated or not realized. There are some factors when there was drawing of lines and the cutting out, and when it said, that members within the camp would do things that, the body had all realized together. The Israelites in the wilderness had all realized together. They were all commanded this, right? There's some factors there that are not the case now. And I'm not getting at the whole that his ways have changed or that his commands have changed. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's some factors there that are not the same now. The body is spread out now. The body does not have a camp together physically. There's a spiritual camping. There is a spiritual unity. And even then, though, there's disjointedness, right? Part of the reason of these videos. So I'm just saying that there's some factors there. And I would suggest seeking the guidance of the Spirit on how to go about these things. Same thing with visiting churches. Same thing about staying in churches, whether or not to leave a church. If you're sitting there stressing, going, man, everything in that sermon was kind of garbage in my opinion, and I'm not feeling spiritually fed, or maybe you are feeling spiritually fed a little bit, but you disagree with certain things, and man, they believe this, and I just know that's not true, and you might be right. Maybe, right? You might be right. But if you're worried about what you should and shouldn't do, if you should stay, if you should go, if you should visit, can you reach, or is it an influence on you? Then shouldn't you be asking the Father what he wants to do with you? Shouldn't you be asking the Father if he wants you to visit these churches, or if it'd be better for you in your walk? And he said, no, I need you elsewhere. We're going to do some things, you and I, over here instead. Or no, stay. I know you're uncomfortable. I know you feel like you're not getting anything out of this, but I have reasons, stay. Shouldn't it be about the Father's will? Isn't that the whole point of being in the body, is our relationship with the Father, getting to know him, doing his will, and thus strengthening our love and our trust with him, because we're walking this out with him. Man, I never thought he would tell me to stay in the church when I know a lot of things going on in that church is not of him. This is part of building up that trust. Vicky Joy and I talked about this in the Rise Up and Build. We talked about how God, however you want to pronounce his name, Yahweh, Yahuwah, Yehovah, Yehovah. There's so many different pronunciations, right? He might ask of you to do things that you would not consider. I mean, we can go all throughout the scriptures. We could spend the rest of tonight, as long as you guys are willing to stay on here, about examples in scripture where there were members of the body that were told to do things that they would not have thought was what God would want them to do, right? I bet you there's some coming to your mind right now, right? And we even have examples of the members of the body sometimes saying, no, God, no, right? Peter in Acts chapter 10 said no, because he was misunderstanding. Again, Acts chapter 10, that's a chapter that's often misunderstood in my personal opinion. But Moses said no. Jonah said no, right? We could go on and on and on and on. So when it comes to the struggles of churches and things, that's my input, that you seek the Father on what he wants you to do. And then you say, okay, when you get clarity on what it is he wants you to do, you ask him how to go about that. It's okay to ask him how and why. You may not always get the answers to the full degree, because sometimes he doesn't want us to know the why. And sometimes he doesn't even want us to know the how. Sometimes it's just a simple trust me, and gives you a simple message. And that calls for you to have faith, right? There's also a church by me promoting to get your, Yes, there's a lot of ungodly things that are not of the Father that are in churches. One could honestly argue that that's kind of always been the case, right? And another thing I disagree with dispensationalism, they'll look to the book of Acts and they'll say, this is the early church. I said, in my opinion, personally, when you see the body of believers being instructed by the Creator, that is church. And I would argue that you find that in the beginning of the book, not towards the end. It started way in the beginning. Oh, yeah, virtual fellowship. Virtual fellowship. That's where I tend to have been for the past 7-8 years. That doesn't mean that I haven't visited churches, church buildings, congregations, fellowships, things like that. And with like your Take on the World crew, right? The circle, whatever you want to call it, our fellowship, and the circles that overlap it and things like that. There's a lot of opportunity to come together, and a lot of these individuals in these circles try to get together outside of the events. They try to, hey, are you in this state? You're only 2-3 hours away from me. Let's meet up. So I can't say that it's always virtual for me, but a lot of it is. So I do have notes, and we'll get to it in a second. I just wanted to see, I want to interact with the chat tonight, if that's okay with you all. I quite enjoy that. That's not something I used to do in videos very often. And if there's stuff in the chat, I want to see. Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with this comment. Again, I'm not, personally, I'm TO. Should we go into that for half a second? Okay, so here's the thing. I am TO, and for those of you who know, you know. And for those of you who do not, or mosques, Ian, that's got to be Chris. Oh, man. Probably joking about the whole neighborhood-friendly terrorist is one of the titles I've received in our circles. So there's jokes on that sometimes. But anyways, okay, so the TO thing, just real quick, this is what I wanted to put out, and this is something I had a real interesting conversation, Chris was there for this, see if he remembers, with Robbie Davidson at a Take on the World. I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2019, but we were talking about TO and why and where we are in that, because within the group that was discussing this, I believe we were under a gazebo shelter thing, and it was pouring rain at this time, I think. And so we had to be really loud. And it was one of those amazing, cool moments of fellowship, because it was cold and rainy. and not ideal situation. And yet we all stayed out there for hours discussing, because it was not about comfort. It was about love of fellowship and discussing what we're passionate about and where we stand. And there was all kinds of disagreements going on in that circle. And I don't remember ever once in those moments people stomping off or yelling or name calling or drawing lines and saying, there was none of that. It was simply, well, this is what I see, and I disagree, and this is why. And it was and there was multiple little groups within the group going on talking about different things, whether or not hell is eternal or it's just a simple, you go there and you become like a vapor. And over here, if the Messiah is one with the Father in the sense that he's equal with God the Father, if he's actually God as well, part of God, or if he's son of God and therefore lower, and all kinds of deep, heavy discussion things going on that are often line drawing situations and causing division, whereas in this situation it was not. And it was really, really neat. And so we were talking about TO, the understanding that a lot of what is considered to have been done away with from the first 80% of the Bible possibly not being done away with. That understanding that the ways of God do not change, and that his commands that he had given his people did not change. And when you hear that for the first time, if you're hearing that for the first time, first thoughts tend to be, legalism, Pharisee, sadducee, right? Justified by works and things of that nature. And I understand that. And I used to be on that side, and I comprehend it. And so one of the first things I like to say on this topic, which we're not going to get too deep into, but I think since it was brought up, and I did want to just say a couple things on this, is that in scriptures, it says that the Torah and the prophets hang on the two greatest commands, right? The Messiah was talking, and they said, what is the greatest command? And Yeshua said, love your God, thy God, with all thy heart and all thy strength and mind and soul, right? And love thy neighbor as yourself. And that all of the Torah and the prophets hang on these two things. And that is a phrase that is often interpreted differently and discussed with great heat in debate, right? But I would say personally, this is where I stand, okay? And if you disagree, I'm okay with that. For the moment, we can disagree and still fellowship. I'm open to that if you are. Hopefully you are, because I have some really cool stuff to talk about in this video that if you haven't received what I'm talking about now, you can still receive those other things. So I'm hoping that that doesn't put you off. But Father's will be done either way. But I would argue that if you believe that the ways of God have changed, or that some things from what is often called the Old Testament are done away with, especially concerning eating clean and feast days and things of that nature, right? They're often seen by those who believe it's been done away with. They see them as rules, what to do and what not to do, rather than like guidelines and instruction, which, okay, I'm not going to get into that. But anyhow, I would argue that if you are a true believer, if you have a relationship with God the Father, if you have a relationship with our Creator, whether or not you think that was done away with, you are observing it, at least to a degree. Now, some TO people might have a problem with me saying that, and the non-TO people might have a problem with me saying that. I might be standing in the middle here, trying to bridge the gap. And this is something that I was discussing with Rob then at Take on the World. I don't know if it was 2018 or 2019, but I had told Robbie Davidson, I said, if you're keeping those two, those are the two greatest. And from what I can see, the Messiah said that everything hangs on that. And in my mind, it's much like we have these two pillars, and these other ones are like subsections. Not that they're not important, but if you're doing these two, this is things that fall under that. So as to say that if you love God, you truly love him with your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and you love others, you have a relationship with the Father, then you are, in my opinion, a Torah observant believer. You may not see it that way, and that's okay. So when I was first born again in 2014, the Father told me to keep the feasts, to drop the holidays and keep the feasts, and I was immersed in studies right away Like within weeks of being born again, I was immersed in studies of the histories and traditions of holidays that are either considered Christian or not, and finding issues with them and feeling conviction to leave those be. And it was not a hard thing for me. For some, it's harder than others. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes it's easier to let go of certain things than other things. There's some other things that I struggled with more that some of you might have been like, oh yeah, no, that was easy to drop, or I never even had to drop that. That was never a problem. But anyhow, he didn't say you must keep these feasts and you have to do them in order to be in alignment with. He didn't come at me like that at all. He told me, hey, you get to do this now. And I didn't see it as a command. It's not that I don't, but I don't treat it in a way of, okay, I have to do this. He told me I have to, right? It's more of I get to. It's still that way. But he said, you get to do these. So I said, okay, cool. And I did Passover within weeks, my first Passover, within weeks of being born again. And, it's looked differently over the years, getting more and more time to do these things. But I loved it. And I loved it not because I thought, man, I'm doing the things that God told me to do. I'm doing good. This is what God wants of us. It wasn't anything like that. It was more of a reopening of the entire Bible in front of me. Because when you look at these feasts, if you're not familiar with them, they tie the entire Bible in them. There is so much depth. If you're not going to consider looking at them so that you can observe them, or you feel like that's just for the Jews or that's just for the past, okay, but still, if you will, consider looking at them just to see what they represent. Because like Passover, you see the representation of the sacrifice of the Messiah there. But I would argue that there's also some end time stuff in Passover. TO people, if you're not familiar with that, hear me out on this. There's some end time stuff in Passover. But anyhow, my point is, so I started doing feasts and I started doing Sabbaths. And then he told me to start eating clean. And this is when I started arguing with the Father. Not that I had to drop them, but I said, no, I know this isn't of you. I'm going to have to test the spirits on this, because what goes into the body is not what defiles man, but what comes out of his mouth, right? And I was, arguing with God at the time, thinking this must be my imagination, my flesh, demons, even though if I'd thought about it, it couldn't have been my flesh, because my flesh was saying, this is stupid. I didn't actually want to eat clean. I didn't want to eat clean. So, to me, that was a zealous, pious thing, so that you can set yourself up as better than others. We've already been 40 minutes. No way. Okay, guys, I'm sorry. It's going to be a little bit longer of a video than I thought. Okay, so my point is this, is that I was doing feasts and I was doing Sabbaths, and then he was telling me to eat clean, and I didn't think it was of God, and I negated it and ate some pork chops, and then went to go do a sermon, and the desire was taken out of me. 3 times this happened, that I had a sermon, a presentation, a video, or a blog that I was ready and excited and pumped up to do, and I felt every fiber in my being, I had to release this. This has to be discussed. I have to. And every other time, they would come out, but I ate pork 3 times in a row. And then I would hear in the spirit, okay, now you're not going to do that sermon. And it wasn't like I still wanted to do it. The moment I hear that, I'd be like, no. And then I'd go to sit down and do it, and I'd just be like, man, I don't feel like doing it tonight. Must not be. And I wasn't connecting the two. So I had to go in prayer and ask for confirmations and seek him on it. And I was like, man, he really does want me to start paying attention to what is often considered the biblical diet of eating clean and paying attention to clean and unclean. Now, keeping feasts, starting to do Sabbaths, Shabbat, and eating clean, right? These 3 things are often 3 of the big 4 things that the so-called TO community sees as differentiating between them and other parts of the body. And yes, I would say that the other parts are still often part of the body. Something the TO community does not all as a unity agree with me on, which is okay. It's not okay, but it's okay. But anyhow, so I was doing these 3 things while still preaching that the Torah was done away with. And I told Robbie that, and I think it sunk in a little bit, and he was kind of confused by it, and we discussed it for a little bit, Robbie Davidson and I, and a few others, It was kind of funny because there was a lot of rambling going on, but then when I was able to get out this bit, it kind of got quiet for a little bit so that I could get this bit out. And I felt like I was the only one in the circle that could say that I was being led by the Father to do these things before coming to the realization and understanding and revelation that the Torah was not done away with. Usually, typically, an individual that comes into TO has done research and seen a video or had talked to somebody and either felt led by God or think they were led by God, and maybe they were not, and that's a whole nother thing, to receive these revelations that Torah is not done away with. And then once you've accepted that, then you start looking at what the Torah, what would be implied there. Then if it's not done away with, if it's still applicable to you, then what would be applicable? So then you need to go back and start looking into it. Maybe it was the exact opposite. I was having the Spirit tell me to keep these things and do these things and observe these things while still preaching and teaching that the Torah was done away with. So how did my mind wrap around that concept? I will tell you, I thought it was personal conviction. For 4 years, I observed feasts, kept Sabbaths, ate clean while teaching the Torah was done away with. Not that teaching the Torah was done away with was my main topic. This is not something I was constantly talking about, but that was my belief. 4 years, I did those things. So how did I even get into this topic? I'm not even sure. There was something else I was going to get into with that, but so the whole point is that I personally would argue that if you're not doing those things, but you do love God truly, and you have a relationship with Him, and you love others, then in my mind, you're Torah observant, and that those are the two most important things, and that you could be doing the other things, but if you don't have those two things, then you are not aligned with the Father, and that you would be better off not doing any of those things at all and focusing on your alignment with the Father and having a personal, direct relationship with the Father and loving Him and loving others, right? And these are things that He does through you. These aren't things that you do in order to get to know the Father. These are things that you get to know Him, and then He does them through you and He works them through you, which is one of the main points of this really good book for these type of studies, is that often, believers will say, I know that it's not works that save you, and that's true. I still 100% agree with that. It's not works that save you. I personally see works as fruit of your relationship with the Father, that if you are connected with Him and He's working on you with your walk through you, He'll start doing what He wants to do. He'll do His will because you're allowing Him to do these things through you. And those would be considered works. So these are not a salvation situation. This is not what saves you. Obviously, if your relationship with Him and the blood covering of the Messiah is what saves you, in order for those works to come through, then the works can't save you. It is produce. And so as to say, it's not that salvation is because of works, but works are because of salvation, right? So for those of you who do not do the whole TO thing, charity and showing love and fellowshipping and being there for others and bearing each other's burdens and things like this, I would call those works. These are fruit producing out of you because of your relationship with the Father, because you've received the bloodshed covering of the Messiah, right? Okay, totally went on a trail there that I was not expecting. Oh man, there's all kinds of comments that I have been missing. I measure my distance from Ian in beard lengths. Nice. Okay. You guys are silly. And Ian doth stand 15 beards away from thine table, young lady. Oh, Chad. Okay. You guys are something else. Cube beards. Nice. Well done. Okay. Man, I have missed a lot of chat. I'm sorry for the pause here. I just wanted to see if there's anything. Oh, wait. Okay. Yeah, okay, so we're going to go back to some of these topics of the whole TO thing just lightly, since I already went way more into it than because we already went into it. How do you know? Ooh, here's one. Okay, I wanted to show this real quick. Yeah, but this right here. How do you know it's Yah's leading? That is a phenomenal question. That is a question that is often debated, discussed heatedly, and can be interpreted and viewed and believed upon in so many different ways. So you wrote, how do you know it's Yah's leading? And I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, and correct me if I am wrong, that you mean generally, how does a person know? But you put in, how do you know? So I'm going to respond to it as, how do I know? Which would also be part of my answer as to, generally speaking, for others, right? And I might say some things here that people disagree with. This might get slightly controversial. You guys ready for some tumbling, just slightly? How do I know it's Yah's leading, right? How the Father speaks to me, from what I've noticed in the past 7 to 8 years, is not necessarily always the same as others. And that has been a hard thing for me to wrap my mind around for a little bit. It took a few years before that really even became a possibility in my mind. So as to say, the first few years, if talking to you, doing fellowship and things like this, I caught comments or said comments and seemed that you couldn't relate, if I felt discernment in the spirit that you were not able to relate to how I believed the Father was talking to me, that you did not know the Father. That would literally be often my thought. And throughout the years, there was experiences and moments where the Spirit made it very clear to me that those individuals do have a personal relationship with the Father. But what they mentioned and discussed about how the Father talks to them was not a way that I could relate. And it took a few of those and some time in this walk for that to finally hit and go, whoa, is it possible that just like how the gifts differ, and just like how the offices differ, and just like how people's prayers and worship and ministries and walks differ, and times of receiving revelations differ, is it also possible that the way the Father speaks to the members of the body may differ from one to another in certain ways? That was a hard thing for me to comprehend. So for me personally, and you might not be able to relate to this, you might hear this and it might make you feel like you should exit the video. But I believe strongly that I hear from the Father directly, internally, and that it is not an audible voice where he speaks to me and I go, whoa, where did that come from? Like a noise outside, and then I go, oh, it must be him. It's not like that. It's more like, when you think things inside your mind, you hear yourself, and you don't actually hear an audible voice, right? But you hear yourself discussing in your mind your thoughts. Okay, I'm going to do this, and then I was thinking maybe that, and whatever you're thinking about in your mind, it's kind of like a conversation between you and yourself, right? Well, it's a lot like that for me. And some of you might be thinking, so how do you know it's not you? There are times that I'm not 100% sure. So I ask for confirmations. I test and I test and I test. And I go into prayer and I look for confirmations and I ask for confirmations. And when I trust that I will get confirmations, when I'm doubting, I get them. Not always right away, but I do get them. Just like many other things in my walk, if you trust seeking the Father, trust that he hears you, believing, having faith that he hears you and that he wants what's best for you, that he'll answer you, you'll get your answer. It may not be the answer you expected. It may not come the way you thought. But so for me, that's how it is, for me personally. And so how do I know Yah is leading? I believe that the Spirit will tell me things from within. And I hear things that it was not like that before I was born again. And when I was very first born again, when I believe I was born again and received the indwelling of the Spirit, right away I started receiving and hearing things that it was not like any time before. And it was not things that I would think. And he has told me things before where I thought no, and I would argue with it. And then it would come to pass exactly as I was told. And when those kind of things happen, then it's not you, right? But when trying to discern if it's yourself, your flesh, your imagination, demons, what have you, I would suggest asking for confirmations. And we see examples of this in Scripture. We see Gideon throwing out the animal skin, the fur on the grass, right? And he didn't stick to just one because he felt he needed multiple confirmations, right? Wanted to make sure. I mean, Scripture literally says, test the spirits, right? What is that? I think it's in one of the first Johns. 1 John 4:1. Do not believe every spirit, but test them and try them, whether they are of God. Okay, so I haven't done this in a while. And without a guest, this is going to be... Okay. Yes, wet fleece, dry fleece. Yes. Okay. St. Ian. I was like, where's that coming from? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, manna from heaven. Most definitely. Yeah, actually, I have a spiritual experience about that when I was fasting and my hunger disappeared while praying and reading and discussing with the Father, when receiving for the very first time the understanding what it means to say, I have meat that you know not of. The first time that I received that understanding was a simultaneous moment that the hunger that was the worst for me during that fast went away, and it felt like I had just eaten. It was an amazing moment and experience for me, because it was a physical, I guess you could say manifestation, but it was a physical mirroring of the spiritual, bringing into an oh my goodness moment. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm going to step away. I'm so sorry to do this, but I have to. But give me 2 seconds, and I will be right back. Okay, sorry about that. And surprisingly, everybody didn't leave. Okay. How many beer lengths away? Misplaced my end. Okay, so I've got a bunch of topics here I want to get into, because there's multiple things that I had planned for tonight's discussion, and Father willing, we're going to get through them. And I'm already at the time that I thought I'd be finishing. So thanks for all of you who have stuck with me tonight on this. Okay, one of the main points I wanted to bring up about this topic, yes, Chad was keeping you entertained. Awesome job, man, working together as a team even now. One of the things I wanted to bring up about this book that ties into last week's topic and video in a way that we did not discuss last video on purpose so that we could discuss it tonight is 2 pillars of our walks spiritually. Okay, are you guys ready for this? This is a topic that I think Chad Schaefer and Alan Aguirre could weigh in on and would find interesting, because I have seen and been a part of and listened to this topic discussed between the two of them. But I am going to bring in a piece that I don't know if they've come to the conclusion of or not, in the middle of the two different pieces. Chad, if you're still there, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Okay, so this book brought this to my attention in 2017, and I received it to a degree, and then kind of forgot about this puzzle piece, and then came to mind again listening to Chad and Alan, and then I forgot it again, and then I got ready for tonight's study, and I said, oh my goodness. So typically within the body, you are either going to lean one way or the other on this topic on the two different pillars. Either you are, yes, listen, either you are going to personally feel more aligned with, led to, comfortable with prioritizing higher spiritual worship or spiritual private time in prayer with the Father, right? Your direct one-on-one, and then your worship, which can still be one-on-one or with others, right? So you have the prayer talk, the privatized, and then you have the more community worship, okay? Now, not just those two individuals. I mentioned those two individuals because from what I understood, at least last time I checked, and I could be wrong, Chad, let us know if I'm wrong about this, but from what I understood, that these two wonderful men of God differed on what they personally felt led to do in their walk as more so than the other. Not that either of them were negating the other one, or that they aren't doing both, but they felt more led one, and the other one felt more led on the other, right? And so typically in my walk, I would have agreed with one. I'm not going to mention names. We'll see if Chad says where he sits on this. But personally, I've always been more led, since on this walk with the Father, to prioritize and get more out of and spend more time in one-on-one prayer time, relationship with the Father, right? That private, I still do this where I plug in my ears and close my eyes, because I find it easier for me to not be distracted out by outside noises and things. And I have found that if I don't plug my ears or I don't close my eyes, it's easier for me to get distracted in prayer, and it's harder for me to get into deep, deep prayer. And that's not that I don't worship, and not that I don't get something out of worship, and not that I don't get something out of community worship and things like that, but private prayer is like, I would lean more towards private prayer more often than worship, right? Still doing both, but one way more so than the other. Okay. And there's other members of the body that would say it's the other way around. They do pray and spend time one-on-one with the Father, but they really enjoy community worship, and they feel like that is where it's at. And if that's lessened or whatever, then that their spirit is dry from that. Not 100%. Let's see what you did there. Okay. So hear me out, Chad. This one's for you, buddy. This one's for you, man. Is it possible that part of this has to do with what we talked about last week? That differing members have differing roles, gifts, leanings, guidance, right? And are going to be leaning one way or the other, right? And some of you are going, okay, yeah, sure. But what if when we lean more towards one and not the other, because of our calling, our personality, things of this nature, that if we do negate, and again, I'm not saying either of those two individuals negates the other one. Please do not think that's what I'm saying. I do not believe that. I have no reason to think that, so I don't think that. But is it possible that if you negate or lessen one to a point where there is way different, and it's that there is issues that come from that? Is it possible that for that? Okay, so this is what I'm trying to say. I see this often in the body. And again, not saying that about those two individuals that I named. I see this elsewhere, okay? I see this often in the body, that members will lean one way or the other, and then after time, you'll start seeing that to the point where they almost cut out the other. And they wouldn't outright say that. Just like somebody who actually believes that they're saved by their works, they're not going to say that they feel that way, because they don't even, the heart's deceived, and they don't actually think that they believe that they're saved by works, because they know that that sentence is incorrect. The scriptures tell us so. And yet they believe it without realizing it. Okay. Yeah, I thought you'd agree, Chad. And I'm not saying that this is new to you, but I've got some things in here, and I think you're going to enjoy this, and maybe even get something, hear something, receive something. And so anyhow, often I see though members and comments and stuff like that. In fact, there was a comment in one of last 2 weeks' videos, I'm not going to say by who or what, that seemed to me to lean towards this extremism of it must be this and not that. And the body needs to be doing this, and you should be doing this instead of encouraging this, right? And I had to seek the Spirit on how to respond to that comment, which I did. But anyhow, my point is that if you're privatizing to the point where you start to feel like you do not need the community, then there's issues, right? Obviously, like we talked about last week, there's going to be issues of not, how are you going to be growing in your walk, in your gifts, in your vocations, in your calling, if you're forsaking the assembly, right? So it's interesting that we mentioned the church before, and I'm not saying that it has to be a church where there's a building with a steeple. Some of them don't have steeples, but most of them have steeples, right? I'm not saying that you have to go to one of those in order to not be forsaking the assembly. There are those who believe that. I don't personally believe that. I personally believe that if you feel like you're lacking a physical fellowship and you feel like it's a tugging on your heart that the Father wants you to go do that, then if He wants it of you, if you ask Him how to go about it, He'll guide you, right? He's not going to say, I want you to do this, and then just sit there and go, well, you better figure it out. She better figure it out correctly. That's not how that's going to work, right? There's a danger in being one-sided. I know. It sounds simplistic, right? It sounds like such an easy thing. This does not sound like a deep, profound revelation, but hear me out, okay? Often those who want to privatize, and that is their one that they lean more towards, it can become an issue to where they feel they need to privatize in order to be ready before being around others. I've done that many times. In fact, it almost stopped me from going to Take on the World 2018 because I was going through some serious struggles. I wasn't backsliding actually at that moment, but I was going through some hard times in my faith, in my walk rather. It's not that my faith was waning or anything like that, but I was going through some things right before Take on the World 2018, and I didn't really know anybody there personally. I'd watched some videos of some of the speakers I recognized, like a few, right? And then I watched even more on my way there. But my point is, I almost didn't go because I didn't feel like I was where I would like to be in my relationship and alignment and in my walk before being around others, right? So the part of the flesh was like, man, you're going to get there and they're going to be like, you don't still struggle with this, but you just came out of dealing with this problem, didn't you? And some of it wasn't even just about me, but I still didn't want there to, okay, so I had reasons to not want to go because I felt like I wasn't 100% in the perfect alignment of where I wanted to be before around others. And there are members of the body that do this. There are those who are outside the body that think they're within that do this, but there are also actual true believers in the body that feel, I can't go to the gathering. I can't go to the conference, the event, the convention. I can't go because I'm still struggling with this. Or maybe I'm not struggling with this, but my spouse is, and I'm supposed to be the leader, or I'm supposed to be equally yoked, or, I still have this, or, whatever. We could list all kinds of examples, right? I'm sure right now, you who are listening can probably think of one or two things in your mind that maybe you see as a secret sin, or maybe you're not keeping it secret and hidden, but whatever, that on certain moments and certain days, you might feel like if you're struggling with that while you're struggling with that is not the time to be around community, right? There's some of you who might be able to relate to that right now, right? But if you are trying to be ready and 100% perfectly aligned, not having struggled before you get with community, then how long is it going to be before you're around the community? And what if God wants to work through you anyhow? What if your privatizing and what you're gaining in your privatizing is meant to come out in community? What if something that could help you with the issues that you're struggling with, that you want to work on in your privatizing, is going to be brought to your attention in the community, and someone's going to say, I've been there, done that, and this is what the Father helped me with, and this is how the Father helped me come out of that, or how to deal with it. Sometimes struggles aren't something that you have to put down or come out of, but rather just walk through. It's not just always about sin. Struggles are struggles, right? There are tribulations and trials that aren't just about what you're doing wrong. And we have examples of that in Scripture to see, and typically the mind goes to Job, right? Because he didn't actually do something to bring that up on him. But there's all kinds of examples that we can see throughout the entire Bible of the true believer, the child of God, the children of God, going through things that wasn't necessarily because they messed up, but rather just tribulation causes patience, and patience endurance, right? And there's these verses on here. Okay, I really don't want to, okay. Yeah, so I've had moments, is what I wanted to get out, that where I didn't want to go to community because I don't get as much out of community worship. I don't get as much out of, I really enjoy fellowship and discussion, but like when there's worship music and people got their hands up, or they're swaying, or they got their eyes closed, or they got their hands up like this, or whatever. It's not that I don't enjoy that and appreciate it, but I don't get as much out of it as like my wife. My wife gets a lot out of that. She would be on the other side of the two columns, right? Where not that she negates personal prayer, but she seems to get a lot out of worship, whereas I get a lot more out of private prayer. Okay, so these are things we have to think about, because when you're discussing with other members of the body, their walk is not going to look like your walk 100%, and they may not receive the same revelations in the same pattern. They might be keeping Torah while preaching it's done away with, while you had to receive it the other way around, or whatever piece of puzzle you want to use on this. Yeah, I did blogs. I also did videos. I still have the WordPress blog. I've got something like 10, 15 blogs on there, little written sermons, but I used to do a lot of writing on Facebook, and then I would do videos as well. Something like 120 Facebook videos on there. Anyhow, so I wanted to bring that idea of privatizing versus community, how there needs to be a balance, right? And so this book has all kinds of information on that. And this book also goes into different personality types and things. Let me see if I can bring up some of the quotes here I wanted to use on this topic before we move on to the next couple topics. And then I'm going to try to end this thing before it's as long as the last time. We all have our place to fit in a puzzle. Yes, we all have a place to fit in a puzzle, and what we have to contribute in the revelations and what the Father has taught us, shown us, and our experiences are also what I would argue to be puzzle pieces, allowing us to come together in rock tumbler formation to come out as polished, lively stones, which is something I'm gonna get into here in a second. But that whole mindset of trying to stay away from community or waiting until your privatizing is where you want it to be in order to be right for a community goes along with the mindset of focusing a lot on doing rather than being, which isn't always an issue for a person who leans that way like I do, but it is something to be aware of for your own walk. If you can relate with me on privatizing being more of something that you feel drawn to than corporate worship, then we need to keep an eye on, reflect on, self-evaluate on, which those types tend to do well, on the idea that possibly there's times where we feel we need to be doing in order to be right rather than being. And then you have the reverse as well, right? Where people are so focused on simply being still in the Father that when they get poked and prodded to do, they say, no, 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 I don't want to go out there and have it be self-righteousness and things of that nature. No, I need to be, no, there needs to be a balance, right? And from what I can tell in the body, often members of the body lean one way or the other, and these are things we need to think about, that pendulum, right? Chances are you feel aligned on one side of the swing more so than the other, and I just want you to consider the other side. Okay, so those who tend to lean more towards corporate worship than privatizing, they do both, but they feel the meat for them more often than not, that they get a lot out of corporate worship, corporate prayer, corporate worship, music, prayer, things like this, can sometimes, without realizing it and without intending to, see if I can find the quote I had here, because the wording was outstanding. And I'm having troubles reading my handwriting. Can sometimes turn spiritual disciplines into works righteousness without realizing it. And it becomes such a desire to do community things, to constantly be around the body, that you start to negate that one-on-one time with the Father that can help hone you in and bring you in on what you need to be doing and what you need to be seeing. There's pros and cons to both. In the sense of, and I don't want to say cons in the sense of how can there be a con in worshiping. I'm saying there's not, but there is a con in if you do just that too much, to the point where you're not balancing, where the focus is so much on that because you feel comfortable there, right? See, that's one of the things for me, okay? Let me get a little vulnerable here for half a second. Corporate prayer can sometimes make me feel uncomfortable. Right, so if I'm at a congregation type of environment, right, and somebody is praying out loud, and you've got the person next to me saying, "Yes, Lord, yes, Amen, so be it, yes," right, and sometimes that's genuine, sometimes it's not, but that's not the point. Is that I'll be in those moments, and someone's doing that, and hopefully that's genuine yeses and amens from their heart, and they just have to express it, okay. But usually in those moments, I get uncomfortable. It's hard for me to get into the zone, the spiritual zone for me, of deep prayer in those type of situations. Corporal prayer, community worship, corporate worship is not something that I tend to feel comfortable with. And the Father has had to break me out of my shell a little bit on that, little bits and pieces. And it started with doing like street evangelism. You'd be talking to somebody and you'd feel in the spirit, I'd feel in the spirit, I need to pray with them and pray over them like right now, because you're not going to remember later, or they need to be in that prayer with you. Just do it. And I'm not the guy that usually likes to do that. I'm the guy that says, I'm going to try to remember to pray for you later when I go deep in prayer by myself at home. To this day, I still tend to do this. If I'm talking to you about something and you're like, man, I'm just really struggling with this, I'm thinking in my head, man, Father, help me to remember to pray about that for them when I can get deep into it and I'm really at the throne, able to and I'm spitting out all these things and I'm like, oh, yes, Father, let them receive this. And if you're not going to open that door for them, help them to understand why and receive the discernment and to walk with you and not be discouraged by it and things like that, right? But what isn't natural for me is to put my hand on somebody, close my eyes, and start praying out loud over them. That is not something that was natural for me. So doing these street evangelisms and ministries, yes, I wear the beard and the full linens. Not quite sure where you're tying that into. Okay, I do get what you're tying that into. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I definitely probably look more like the other side of the pendulum. Maybe I'm supposed to look more like the other side and be more of this side so I can be more of that get bridger. I don't know. Yes, I am, Chad. I got it now. Anyhow, so doing street evangelism and doing ministries, and I'd want to pray over somebody right then and there because I'd feel it in the spirit that that's what I'm supposed to do, not that that's what I want to do. And so I go, okay, and I try to step out of my comfort zone and say, okay, hey, do you mind if I pray with you or over you right now? And more often than not, even atheists will say, yeah, sure. they have this mindset of, you know what, I don't know if it's going to do any good, but, they can see if you've been talking to them, you didn't just come up to them and say, you need Jesus, let me pray over you now. But you're like, hey, do you want to talk about something? And you're talking about family and struggles and things. And they say they disagree with you on beliefs and stuff. And you go, okay, I understand that. I didn't always believe what I believe now. But do you mind if I talk to you about this? If you have that barrier broken down and you're able to, and they can see that you're being genuine, usually if you offer prayer, whether or not they believe that God's actually going to hear it, usually they won't say no. Not always, but usually they won't say no. And so I would have these moments, and I would hear in the spirit, okay, lay your hand on them. I wouldn't always hear that, which is another thing to think about. But there would be times where I'd hear that, and I'd go to do it, and I'd be like, man, this is so uncomfortable for me. I'm not a lovey, touchy person. So if I see you in person, and I hug you, and I say I love you, and I grab your shoulder or pet your, well, if you're a man, I might pat your chest out of love. I'm not going to do that to a female. But if I lovey touchy at all, if I hug you at all, or touch your shoulder, or huddle with you in prayer, just know that is very uncommon for me. And it's I have to step out of my comfort zone for things like that. So either I really, really love you and know you and in the body, and I'm thankful for it. Like with Dirt, I can't help but hug him. I'm like, oh, I love that brother, right? And Chad, I have to grab them and say, man, do you know how much I love you? But I don't always feel like doing that. So I would go to pray over these people, and I would hear in the spirit, if you pray internally and do not say it out loud, they have no idea what you're praying about. And they might be thinking all kinds of things. And they might not get to hear what your prayer conversations with me is like. They might be thinking that you're just doing the sinner's prayer. They might be thinking that you're doing a 1, 2, 3 sentence, A plus B equals C, and you are now saved. They might be thinking that. And my prayers personally aren't like that. I don't recite the Lord's Prayer, what people call the Lord's Prayer, word for word over people. That's not what I often feel led to do. So I had to start learning that if I'm going to be praying over people in evangelistic moments like that, like street preaching, often it needs to be out loud. So he was breaking me out of that show is what I'm getting at. But there are things to consider there, right? Okay, so I know I can be all over the place. Yeah, corporate spirituality. There's all kinds of things in this book that they talk about, like the personality types and the strengths and weaknesses with that, and how you don't want to ignore your weak side. They have a term in here, they call it the shadow side. If you're going to get this book, you're going to see the term shadow side. I really don't like that they use that terminology. It rubs me wrong. And there's even I think a whole chapter in this book that I just outright disagree with. And then there's little portions here and there that I disagree with. But overall, I find this to be a phenomenal on-the-spot book. And they talk about the different personalities and things. And one of the topics they talk about is that if you have a strength, if you have something that you are comfortable with, and your gifts and your talents and your vocations and callings and things like this, and you know that the Father's doing these things through you, then when your mind thinks about how to grow and mature in your walk, often you think of that topic. How can I be an even better teacher? How can I be an even better preacher? How can I be a better street preacher, evangelist? How can I encourage even more? Because that's what you enjoy. That's what you feel called to do. That's your gifts and talents. But sometimes what God wants to work on you on is not the one that you feel comfortable with and is not your strength, but rather brings about some balance, right? And this book brings out the profound, I would say possibility, but I actually believe it's more than a possibility, that it's outright true. The understanding that if you lean one way on something and ignore your weakness on the other, it will manifest itself in a way that you do not want, right? So some examples were if you tend to be more about knowledge and intelligence and information rather than emotions and feeling, then there is a chance that you can possibly get so wrapped up into details and things like this that you will become obsessive and excessive in those details, but also that your emotions might get pent up because you're not nurturing that part of your spirit, and that they will manifest themselves by exploding. And so, I want to ask you, the listener, right now, is there any time in your walk, I'm going to ask that the Spirit reminds you of some times in your walk, if you're listening, and if you can agree with me in the Spirit on this, that where because of this not nurturing of a weaker side, something that is not your strength, because of not nurturing that, it manifested itself in a way that not only was something that you didn't want to happen, but maybe you found it embarrassing. Maybe you even found yourself saying, whoa, what was that? I never do that. Why did that just happen? Right? And then you're mad at yourself and you're like rebuking things, or you're repenting. And these are good things. I'm not saying it's not good to rebuke the flesh and spirits, right? And I'm not saying that it's not a good thing to repent. These are obviously all good things, but also getting to the root of issues helps you cut that out, helps you allow the Father to cut it out of you, right? Because it's him that does it, not you. He's the one that does the pruning. If you're able to recognize and acknowledge what is the root of an issue, it's a lot easier to grow and cut things out and receive correction. Hi there, April Ray, coming in quite late into the game of this video. There's a lot behind this discussion, but not that you need it to understand where we're at right now. Okay, so did anything come to mind? Did anything come to the mind? Did any of you have moments that came to the mind that the Spirit reminded you of? Maybe something you haven't even thought about in a while, where you exploded due to not nurturing a part of you that you were not typically paying attention to. No, there's no reason to be sorry. I didn't mean to like call you out on that, April. People come and go throughout. I was just saying hey, and was allowing you to know that there's like an hour and a half behind us. But that's not a reason to not stay with us right now. Let me find, if I can, in this book, they have some pretty cool stuff about my wife and I were going over this the other night, and we were giggling and red in the face because we could not believe how accurate this book was on recognizing our strengths and weaknesses and how they manifest. So let me see if I can't. And I know you're probably thinking, why didn't you write it in your notes? I did, and I'm having troubles reading my writing. Where is it at here? Hold on. I have these cards. Okay, here we go. Okay, yeah. All right, here we go. Okay. Yes, we were giggling. Not something that you're going to see happen to me often. Honestly, no matter how well you know me, it's not. You're just not going to see that often. But somebody who can tend to make me laugh almost all the time is Chadrick. So if you see me hanging out with Chadrick in person, that's by more likely you're gonna hear me get really loud and laughing, because he just knows how to make me laugh like crazy. Okay, so here we go. You guys ready? Personality types from the MBTI and connections to strengths and weaknesses. You ready to go? Okay, so if you're extroverted over introverted, then your primary area is world other rather than self, right? Therefore, you have a preference for action, and your weaker side that would need nurturing would be reflection. So if you feel like you are an extroverted personality, there's a chance that self-evaluation, reflection, things like this can be weak when you're not paying attention to that, right? Maybe you don't feel as comfortable. You're more likely, if you're extroverted, to be comfortable in corporate worship rather than privatized. You would seek participation and reunion, right? And probably want to avoid exclusion and loneliness. It says that would be a hell to you, right? So why am I bringing these up? To help you recognize where you're at with personality, but also to see that if there's things that are on the other side of your personality, those are the things that tend to make you feel uncomfortable. You can't just dismiss them and negate them. And when you come to community and you come to the body, the rest of the body can help you. It can edify itself on those things that you don't feel comfortable on, and that you have struggles with, and that you feel weak on, and that you would rather, when left to your own self, ignore. And you say, I'm not by myself. The Spirit tells me, yes, okay, but do you quench that Spirit? Do you push him off? And like I said before, sometimes the Father likes to work through us, towards each other. It's not just direct. It's also through each other, because he wants to see the body work together. He wants to see the body be together. I would argue this is why we see the Messiah praying to the Father. But that's, again, a whole nother thing. Okay. So you have that social versus solitary, right? You're going to lean more towards one than the other, more than likely, which means you need to pay attention to that other one not being too far down, because it might manifest. If you are refusing that alone time with the Father, not refusing, but not realizing that you're dismissing it, then answers to prayers and direct communication and things can be lacking. And you say, I don't know why I don't feel like I'm getting answers on these things, and I don't know why I feel like I'm not getting clarity and discernment on these things. Maybe it's because you're not looking at that other side that you tend to want to stay away from, right? Okay, so you have the sensing versus intuition, right? The second letter of the MBTI. So sensing is you're more likely to have the aspect of reality being concreteness and immediacy, what's right there in front of you, what is solid, right? Whereas the N would be anticipation and vision. And you need that balance, at least with the body. That if you're looking at just what's in front of you and what is seen, what is concrete, and you're not able to recognize the vision part of the body and things like that, then you could be having troubles with superstition, suspicion, fear of change, issues that come out of that struggle, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of charts here, and I could go through all these charts about how extroverted might have the negative expression of anger, attack, emotions manifesting out in a way that you don't want. Introverted might have fear and withdrawal tendencies. Your S letters might have issues of attachment, whereas your N might have elation and depression issues. Your knowledge types are possibly, through negative expression, going to have apathy and criticalness due to lack of the body and the lack of the balance of the body and spirituality. Whereas the feeling side instead of the knowledge side might have the negative expression of sentimentality and overprotectiveness, right? Your judge types might have inappropriate, controlled judging others, right? Whereas your perception side, the other side of that last letter, might have failure to take responsibility. So this is a really cool book, and there's a lot of things in here that I'm not going to get into all these things, but they go over like information graspers tend to be structurally closed to being addressed by God directly. Info takers have difficulty being receivers of God's voice. Functionally oriented people struggle with being still and letting God act his will on his time, right? Performance-oriented individuals have troubles with being, with having the issue of turning spiritual disciplines into works righteousness, right? It's spiritual formation, the Messiah forming himself in you for the sake of others and for the edification of the body, but overall for the sake of others, because ultimately that's a glorification of the Father, is the reversal of to bring about desired results, acting to bring about desired results, being reversed to being acted upon by the way that he wants. And that can be applied either way of the columns, either way of the pendulum swing, right? Okay, so I had so much stuff I wanted to get into with this video, and it's already getting later, and I had all these pages I wanted to go into, but I think I'm going to bypass a lot of this. Let's see, what was it that are... Okay, yeah. I'll just quickly say this, and then I have a couple other things, and then I'm going to let you guys go. I didn't get to go into details, but I think you guys get the generic idea, right? Okay, so our relationships with others are not only the testing grounds of our spiritual life, but also the places where our growth towards wholeness in Christ happens. The process of being formed in the image of Christ takes place in the midst of our relationships with others, not apart from them, right? So people like me that are introverted and tend to be more privatized than corporate need to know these things, but corporate needs to know that too, because if you're so drawn to corporate, you might get so drawn into that moment that you're not actually getting out of the corporate where you're supposed to be. Okay, if that makes sense. But it takes place in the midst of our relationships with others, not apart from them. We learn to be Christ's children for others by seeking to be yielded and obedient to God in the midst of our relationships. Right? If you're still wondering after last week's video about how God wants to use you and what your gifts are and your callings and your vocations and your talents and things like that, might I suggest that a lot of that comes to play and forefront when you're actually around people and it comes out and you're able to see it in the action. Say, what is my gift that God wants to use of me, through me, towards others? Well, go be around others and see what God prods you to do. Right? I think often we want to have it figured out and then go put into practice. And often it's being put into practice that it comes about, which is something I think we went over last video, right? Okay, so let me grab out a couple scriptures here and then possibly talk about a vision and possibly not, right? The whole lively stone thing. So let's see here. One of the parts of scripture that I would suggest for this study is 1 Peter chapter 2, right? You're lively stones built up in a spiritual house, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices, being your prayers and your letting go of things and putting yourself second to others, right? Acceptable to God. And then you've got the verse that it's talking about the Messiah being the chief cornerstone, right? And that's kind of important for what I wanted to get into here. And there's all kinds of stuff in 1 Peter 2. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but there's a lot of things in there that's good for this study. So I don't mean to be sounding like I'm rushing through it here, but I'm been on here way later than I planned. Okay, let's see. Galatians chapter 4 is another one. Also, well, Galatians 4-5, and it covers a lot of things that are often misunderstood. That is not what I'm getting at with this study. And some of you might be like, man, Galatians 4 is my answer as to why you shouldn't be TO from earlier. And I would argue that I disagree, and I don't negate chapter 4 of Galatians, but rather understand it differently. Okay, so my point with Galatians 4 was what? Because I had something here. Where's it at? I know I had something in here. It was 4:2-5, and there was some things there. Okay, you're under tutors and governors until the appointed time of the Father. Something else here. Maybe it was about the temptations that come through because of the different gifts and strengths and weaknesses and things, and how your strengths can be used by the enemy to bring in temptations, but so is your weaknesses. This book was talking a lot about like individuals who tend to be knowledge and intelligence is part of their gifts and their main focus and things like that will often negate other things like visual art and things of that nature. And if you negate nurturing that part of your spirit, thinking it's not important because you don't seem to get as much out of it, it will manifest in ways you do not want it to, and will cause about struggles. And that this might be, the book suggests that this might be one of the main issues why many pastor types tend to struggle with pornography, because they are so much interested in knowledge and understanding and intelligence that they are not nurturing the part of them that they do not realize needs visual art. So instead of nurturing that in a positive way, it pents up and then manifests and brings forth struggles. Okay. I'm talking about shofar blasts and animals reacting to shofars and things of that nature. Nice. Okay. Okay. Galatians 5 talks a lot about what I was trying to get at with 1 Corinthians 7 in the last video about going towards the calling through which you're called, and that how it's going to differ sometimes, and that there is such a thing as personal convictions within the body, and that some are going to be called to do things a little bit differently than others. I would argue that Galatians 5 is talking about that, whether or not people realize that. And then you have the fruits of the Spirit, which are things to pay attention to when you're looking at trying to detect what is of God and what God is calling you to do. Does it bring about those fruits? Okay, last part of scripture that I wanted to bring up. No, it's okay. I understand. I've been on the other side of the fence, Melissa. I've been on the other side of the fence where you're listening to a video and you really are listening, but you're having a conversation in the chat. Chadwick and I used to talk about this, about how you could be in a video and you look over at the chat and you're like, what is going on? Does anybody even care? And we've laughed about that. We talked about how that's, you know, even if nobody's paying attention, if you feel like God told you to do the video, then you do what you're told to do. But no, I've been on the other side of the fence. I've been there. And sometimes you guys might see me in the chats under the DNG 144 or DNG Ministries, however, commenting in videos. And just because I'm commenting and talking about stuff does not mean I'm not paying attention. So I'm not discouraged. Don't worry about that. So anyhow, last portion of scripture I wanted to get into is 1 Corinthians 3. Okay. And Paul is talking to the church in Corinth, but I would argue that it is also for us now, right? And some people have troubles when I say that, and it triggers, and they say, no, it's got to be context. And if it was written for the church of Corinth, then we look at it for us now to make sure that we're, you know, not struggling with that. But it's in scriptures. And to me personally, if it's in scriptures, then God can use it to apply to you. And if you're going to stick to just the context of whoever it was written to or spoken to is the only person that it applies to, then you're going to end up throwing out the entire Bible, in my opinion. Right? So anyhow, there's something interesting in here about 1 Corinthians 3 that I'm not going to get into, but Watchman Nee, if you're not familiar with him, has written some serious in-depth books while he was in prison in China, I believe, due to preaching. It was Watchman Nee and his books, I used to read his books a lot years ago, that suggested that if you are in your walk with the Father, personal relationship with the Father, for 3 or more years, then you should be on meat more so than milk, and you should be spiritual more than carnal. That the 3-year mark is a mark of a stepping stone of at that point. Okay, and now I'm not saying that's the case, but he does bring up a good point, because Paul is talking about this, right? And he says, I fed you with milk and not with meat, and you were not able to bear the meat, and yet now you are able, for yet you were carnal. And then he starts to say, why is there envying and strife and divisions? Are you not carnal and walking as men, right? And we're about to get into this, and this is going to tie into the last 2 videos, right? But at this point, 3 years had passed from Paul's preaching to the church of Corinth. So after 3 years, Paul's like, hey, you guys are still acting carnal. And I didn't come at you with the heavy, meaty stuff that was over your head. I didn't come at you with the deep, heavy stuff. I didn't do what people call the Torah terrorist thing, right? I didn't come at you and start hitting you with all the heavy revelations, recognizing that you were babes in Christ. You were new to the body. You were coming into this walk. So I came at you with milk, not meat. But it's been 3 years. What are you doing? And then he starts calling out the issues that he's having. And if you all would have grace with me for just 1 second, I have to walk away again for 2 seconds, but I'll be right back. And we'll get into it. And then we're going to hit some depth for a couple of minutes. And maybe I'll go into the vision, depending on the Spirit leading. And if you guys are still here, then we'll end out. All right, 1 second. All right, sorry about that. You guys are awesome for sticking around. Okay. 1 Corinthians 3. Here we go. This is the last heavy point that I really wanted to get into with this video. Okay. And this kind of ties in even more what I was getting at with the whole polished stone things. Are you guys ready? Okay. So Paul starts saying, one of you says, I'm of Paul, and then the other says, I'm of Apollos. Is this not a fleshly thing, right? Is this not carnal? Who's Paul, who's Apollos, but ministers that you believe that God gave to every man, right? And he goes on about it. And so this is a huge issue that I see in the body. Huge. And it's funny because just like the whole I'm not saved by works, members of the body say, I don't do that. I know that, Apollos, that Paul planted and Apollos watered and God gave the increase. I know that. And they can, some of them can spit out the verses word for word and give you the address and things like that. And yet they say, oh, you listen to so-and-so? I listen to so-and-so. You listen to Rob Skiba? I listen to Dr. Pigeon. You listen to Doug Hamp? I listen to David Carrico, et cetera, right? And I'm just plugging in names, okay? So I'm just saying that, and look, I understand. I'm not saying that that it's bad to lean towards one teacher or preacher that you feel speaks more truth or more accurate, or the way that they teach hits you. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. What I'm getting at is the members of the body are cutting each other off. Remember, one of the things I keep bringing up in the past 3 videos is the disjointedness of the body. The left leg and the right leg are supposed to be walking together, but the left leg goes, oh, you pronounce the name like this. And the right leg says, you're not even eating clean. And then the left arm says, man, you guys aren't even using the right version. And then the right arm is like, you guys are all worried about all these details and none of that matters. It's all been done away with. Right? Shouldn't we just be focused on doing the Father's business? When you're in combat, right, and most of you, possibly all of you, aren't familiar with combat, right, actual physical combat. I'm not talking about spiritual combat. You've all been in spiritual combat, whether you recognize it or not. You can be an unbeliever, and you've been in spiritual combat. You just might not recognize it. But I'm talking about actual physical combat, right? When you're in actual combat and you're getting fired upon by your enemy, right? Because our true enemy now is a spiritual thing, right? But let's look at this in combat context, right? Because we are in a spiritual war. It is spiritual warfare. And we have an adversary and an advocate. And we are warring against principles and dominions and strongholds and evil spirits. Notice I didn't say evil people that are being used by the evil spirits. But it is a war. And when you are in war and you're getting shot at and you're shooting back and you're taking cover, the first thing on your mind isn't looking at the person next to you who's been taking cover with you and helping you and saying, hey, you disagree with me on et cetera, blankety blank blank. I don't want to be next to you in this foxhole anymore. I'm going to go give myself cover while getting shot at. I'm going to go over there because you don't wear the same additions to your armor that I do. You use different sights on your weapon. In fact, you even use a different type of weapon. You've got a handgun, I've got a rifle, you've got a rifle, I've got a machine gun, etc. Right? You don't see that in real combat. You know, and in real combat, sometimes there are individuals who do not have a combat MOS, military occupational specialty. They have a different job than combat, and yet they find themselves in situations of combat. And combat soldiers don't say, get away from me, you weren't trained for this. But I see the body cutting each other out for disagreements. I see in the body unnecessary division. I see in the body disjointedness and a lack of connection because of disagreements. And I understand, okay? You can bring up any of the heavy topics. Should we list some of the heavy topics without going into them, right? Either the Messiah is God and one with the Father, or he's Son of God below the Father and not actually God. Right? That's been a heavy topic lately and can cause some serious division. And you have speaking in tongues. Is it what we see the charismatics saying, or is it not? Pre-tribulation, we're going to get taken up before the Messiah comes back. We get taken up at this exact same time. All these different topics. I use KJV. I use ISR. I use such and such, ESV, RSV, NIV, etc. You say Yahovah, I say Yahuwah, Yehovah, or I say Yahweh. You say Jesus, I say Yeshua, Yahushua. I understand why these topics are important. I get it. If you think that when I say the body is having unnecessary division and cutting each other out over these topics means that I don't care about these topics, or that I don't have a position on each and every one of these topics, was Paul of God or was he a false teacher? Is the Messiah God or is he not? I understand, these are big topics. They are heavy topics. And I understand that there is a desire to say, you're not of the body I'm of, because I feel clearly that God has let me understand this, and this is a huge part of my walk. Your TO, and I believe the TO is done away with. And I'm not saying you and I as in whatever. I'm just saying these are topics. These are heavy topics, and they are important, and they need to be discussed. But you know what? They cannot be discussed and bring about togetherness and connection in the body when the body's cutting each other from each other over these topics instead of discussing them. How do you expect the body to come together? How do you expect to receive balancing from other members of the body when you're cutting each other out because so-and-so is a flat earther or a hollow earther or believes it's a globe? I have an opinion and a belief, and I'm very strongly feeling where I sit on all of these topics I mentioned. But I also fellowship with individuals that are on the other side of every single one of those topics I just mentioned. Every single one of those topics. I have friends that disagree with me, but I get out of the relationship. I get something out of the fellowship with them. I see God using them and working through them. I listen to their arguments, and sometimes it further strengthens where I sit, and sometimes it makes me go, I'm going to have to think about that and go in prayer again, because surely I'm not right about everything. I use the Zadok calendar, I use the Orthodox, or whatever other names, or sliver versus conjunction, or Sabbath day to day, or evening to evening. Do we really, as a body, want the time of the return and judgment and possibly maybe the message of the two witnesses before those things, right? Unless you think that it's already come to pass, your premillennials and preterists and things like that, right? But do we really want it to come to light? How about I say it that way? For wherever you stand on the timeline or whatever, do we really want it to come to light and be brought to our face that the Father says, none of you were right about everything, and you were all supposed to be polishing each other in the rock tumbler. I gave you differing gifts and differing strengths and weaknesses and understanding and revelations and puzzle pieces so that you would come together, so that the body would come to the edifying of itself, right? Isn't that what we read? Apostles and teachers and preachers and prophets and evangelists for the edifying of the body. And yet what? And yet, wasn't it showing? Oh, that's not the one I wanted. And yet, there's severed limbs everywhere. severed limbs everywhere. You see the times that we're in. You see the distress of the world around us, and whether or not you see it as an end times thing is not the point. You still see it, right? Is this really a time to be looking at other people that are in the foxhole who might also be wearing the armor of God and saying, you don't say his name the same way I do. Surely you don't know him like I do. Is this really the time for that? 1 Corinthians 3. You've got the Apollos and the Paul. Your different teachers and different ministries. A wise master builder, as a wise master builder, I've laid the foundation, and another builds on. But let every man take heed how he builds thereon. Let every man take heed how he builds thereon. Some of you might not like how I say this, but personally, I would say that you can apply that sentiment to building of stones in terms of fellowship, as well as building stones of works and beliefs. Okay? I'm not saying that that's what Paul's saying here. I'm saying that I would argue that you can apply that there. Okay, so for other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is the Messiah. Right? So he's the cornerstone. He's the foundation. And as long as you can see that foundation in someone else, as long as the Spirit allows you to discern that foundation has been laid, and if you don't know, maybe you should ask instead of making an assumption. But when you're able to discern that foundation stone is there, then it could be a bunch of garbage built thereon, but they're still of the body, right? What if you cut them off thinking they're not of the body? I don't need this nonsense. I don't like hearing the opposing view of my own beliefs on this because I've already had to fight that when I came to the understanding. Therefore, I'm going to cut so-and-so off thinking that I have the right answer and they don't. And instead of wanting to help them see that, I'm going to cut them off because I tried in a couple sentences. I posted a few verses and they just did not get it. And I don't know why they didn't get it because I forget what it's like to have been me before me now when I didn't receive that revelation. I forgot. Right? Let's say you have a bunch of puzzle pieces of truth that the God has allowed you to have. And let's say that all your puzzle pieces are 100% accurate. What if? Hypothetical, right? Let's say that's the case. Then should you really be cutting people off because you see that they don't have the same pieces? Listen, folks, I see this in the body all the time. All the time. On Facebook and in groups and in pages, in ministries and in videos. What happened to attacking the principle but loving the people? What happened to debating and discussing, like Bereans studying and walking away understanding that person's still a member of the body? Do you not remember when you didn't have all those pieces? This is one of the things that most people who listened and watched Skiba, even that disagreed with him, would say about Skiba. That he could discuss with you passionately about a topic, and he drew the line firmly on where he stood. But if he believed that you were of the body, even though you disagreed with him on whatever topic, he would still hug you, shake hands, and talk to you, and have fellowship with you, and consider your view on things. So much of the body is hurting and missing Skiba and Russ Dizdar. And there's a bunch of other leaders I've been noticing that haven't been doing well health-wise, and so many members in the body are seeing this and saying, what is going on? What's a shift in spiritual season, I think is what's going on. But we should maybe look at those leaders that we see as being such powerful men of God and look at the good things that God did through them and focus on the strengths that they portrayed that God did through them and start emulating. There is topics I would love to debate with people. I like debate. I used to be on a debate team, and I used to be kind of good at it in terms of articulating where I stood and even persuading and even doing street evangelism and ministries and things like that. God has used me in times to persuade individuals into considering something that they normally wouldn't consider. I have seen people change their mind on a heavy topic that they had built stones upon, and in under 20 minutes of a discussion with me in my living room. And it wasn't because of me, it's because, if it was an actual true change towards truth, then obviously that was God doing it, right? And it was God-given gifts that were being utilized. So this isn't about me. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying I enjoy debate. I enjoy discussions. But if you will have noticed, in the past 7 to 8 years, I haven't done any ministry live or otherwise video debates. Why? Because individuals that I've seen doing ministries that do debates, whether or not they're good at it, whether or not they have good points, often I see a lack of walking away as community. So I don't want to be a part of it. I would love to sit down and when I was doing Disputed Lands with Chad, I used to talk to Chadwick and I said, man, part of me wants to start a show and have it called something like Heated Topics or the Heavy Throwdown or whatever. And each episode we would hit a topic and it would, myself and someone else or maybe multiple people on both sides would discuss the views of the two opposing views, allowing the listener to understand where both sides sit, hearing the points and giving it a true consideration, as well as the people debating to hear the other person out. Because I think a lot of times when we disagree with somebody, we don't even, I see so many members of the body not care to understand what the other side is even getting at. We hear a couple of words, we get triggered. Oh, Torah observance, they're under the law, they're works righteousness. I'm not going to hear them out. I know better. Flat earther, whatever the topic is. Even if you've changed sides and you're familiar with that other side, when you're discussing things with people, are you actually listening and hearing them out on where they stand? Because not every two people of one particular belief see it the same way. You cannot point at any movement, any fellowship, any congregation and say they all believe this about small stones. If you're going to say foundational stone about Messiah, then yeah, you might be able to say that about a group. You might be able to say they all say this. You might be able to say that about foundational stones. When you start getting to other things, you can't lump them all in. You can't. And that's why there's such an issue with titles and labels, and why so many believers are now not calling themselves Christians anymore, because of what so many other people who call themselves Christians are a part of. They don't want to be associated with that. But no matter what title or what label you go under, there's somebody else that also self-prescribes under that label and title, and they are in complete opposition with you on so much that you're like, why? Because maybe labels and titles aren't things that we should be so focused on. Maybe that desire to communicate so much in just one word is part of the problem, because then it takes away our communication. And so that we don't actually get to hear the other side out, because we got to hear their 2-word title. And therefore we've now applied the preconceived understanding and notions of what we relate, word association with that title, without even hearing them out on it, because there's no need to. We've already talked to somebody who also prescribed to that, not understanding that it might not be the same thing. Why does the body not want to communicate? Why is there such a fear of hearing something that you believe God's already told you is not true? Why can't you hear them out? If you believe God has made it super clear to you that it's not true, then you should be comfortable in being able to hear them and wait your turn and listen to what is important to them and why they see those things, and have a conversation and discuss with them. Well, I used to think that too. I believe God showed me this. Can you hear me on this? There are so many different understandings and beliefs and perceptions on things that there needs to be communication. There needs to be counsel. First Corinthians 3. If any man builds upon this foundation, so for other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is the Messiah. Now, if any man builds upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, woods, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest. For the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. And if any man's work abide that he built on, then he'll receive a reward. And if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer a loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Everything built upon is lost, and yet shall still be saved. Why? Because the foundation is still laid. Why is the body forgetting that? I had a vision 4 years ago. And when I say a vision in this particular reference, I'm not talking about in my mind's eye, I was thinking about things that I'd like to have happen, or an event was brought into my mind and I was like, oh, this must be of God, it's a vision. There are those things. I don't get those as often. That tends to be something for other members of the body that they get to bring to the table that I don't tend to. But in this particular instance, when I say vision, I don't know what else to call it, but it was kind of like a dream when I wasn't sleeping. It was shown to me, and it was in deep prayer. And I was like, what is this? And then God explained it to me. So I'm not going to say that an angel came and yanked me up and took me to another situation like you see when, like Ezekiel said, I had a vision and an angel came and brought me up, and you get that in scriptures, right? When John said, I had a vision. I'm not saying it's like that download. Okay, yeah, maybe download. But this was like, I don't usually get information like this. So this one stuck out to me. And the few times I do get information like this, usually I get knocked out. It might be hard for some of you to understand, but I've literally had about a handful of situations since being born again. In fact, I had one right before I was born again that was getting me prepared for my walk, where I blacked out, not due to drinking or drugs or anything like that, not due to head damage, but rather getting anxious, panicky, and then all of a sudden, lights out. And in that lights out, I had spiritual experience where I was shown and explained things, and I come to and I'm like, whoa. And then, I'm shown how it's in scripture. And then sometimes I don't fully understand until years later what it fully meant. Okay. But I've had a handful of instances like that. So this was more like that, but I didn't black out for this one, I don't think. I'm pretty sure this one I was in deep prayer, and I was studying this book, and I was studying this book, which is kind of a neat book, and I wanted to bring up for tonight's video. I'm not going to go into what it has to do with things, but anyhow, I was studying these topics. It was this vision happened prior to me doing the original rock tumbler video and the original polished stones video that I did in 2017, which, if you can get through my fast speaking and some spiritual immaturity, there is some depth and a lot of knowledge brought to those two originals that I did not bring into these ones. I tried to talk a lot slower and work through things and give examples of things rather than just, because that's who I used to be. I used to just throw it out there, and it's hard to keep up with that. I was listening to the original videos the past couple of weeks, and I had to keep pausing, and I was like, man, this is draining. Forget this. But anyways, can you put those titles in the description so I can get them? The book titles, I was going to put the book titles in the comments on my Facebook post, but I don't know if you're friends with me on Facebook, April. I think you are, but here, I'll just, the book for last week's was Courage and Calling. I can't remember who it was written by, but if you do go check out the video last week's, I bring it up and you can pause it. Or if you have me on Facebook, you can go look at the post if it allows you to see it, because they've been hiding a lot of my stuff in my timeline lately. But I put the link for the book there, and I'll be doing that again with these books. But this one is Invitation to a Journey by M. Robert Mulholland Jr. And those two books work really well together. And then the third book that I brought up is called The Present Future, which is 6 Tough Questions for the Church by Reggie McNeil. I don't even know who these authors are. I know nothing about them. Yeah, I think maybe I have you as a friend, April. I think back when you were guested on Disputed Lands, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay, so the vision, right? So I was doing this study for myself, not for sermons and videos, even though it turned into that. And I was doing the study, and I felt strongly led to go into prayer to repent on things about forsaking the assembly and shying away from corporate worship so much, because it makes me feel so uncomfortable. And a lot of times it feels for me disgenuine. And even though I'll see people in it that I don't feel like they're being disgenuine, I feel like for me to emulate what they're doing would be disgenuine. I don't feel naturally to have my hands palms up and to sway back and forth. If that's what you feel in the spirit, awesome. Do not let anybody say anything to stop you from otherwise. You do you. And what you feel spiritually comfortable in. If that's how your body expresses as you're in the spirit doing your thing, then awesome. Who cares what anybody else thinks? But for me, it doesn't come out like that. My hand doesn't go up in the air. I don't sway back and forth. I don't have my palms up. That doesn't mean it's not genuine for other people. It just means that that's not comfortable for me. And usually in corporate worship situations, there's music playing, and it's like I told you guys before, I plug my ears when I get into deep private prayer, and I have to block out thoughts. And then I ask the Father to get rid of all my thoughts so that I can just be cleared of all that. And not like some kind of yoga meditation thing. I don't ask to be like some kind of blank room or something. I just try to get all my thoughts out so that I'm not focused on what my flesh wants. And then I start talking to God about why I'm been stressed and anxious and what I'm worried about and what I see problems with. And I start going through these things. And then there's a point in the deep prayer where all of a sudden it hits what I consider real deep prayer. And I start to go, whoa, I'm coming at you with all my worries and concerns. Good and all, but that is not, I'm coming to the King of everything. I am coming to the throne of the Creator. And I'm just talking about, I'm uncomfortable with this, and I don't like this, and I'd like help with that, and I'm struggling with this. It's good to bring those things up, okay? But there's that point in my deep prayers when I got my ears plugged and everything, where all of a sudden I start thanking God for everything. And as I'm thanking him for things, I start getting reminded of all the amazing attributes of God. And yes, I'm struggling with this, but the fact that I can even see that I'm struggling with that and that I'm not blinded to it means he's already wanting to work on it with me and has been. Instead of feeling discouraged by my flaws and shortcomings, the fact that I can see it means he's allowing me to realize that. He's allowing me to see it, and therefore he's willing to work on it with me. He's already there. So instead of saying, this is what I'm struggling with, I need to start saying, what is it? Help me to discern when to step aside so you can start working on this more, and help me to step aside so you can start working on it more. Obviously, you're already willing to work on this because I can see it. You know, and so it's hard for me to get into prayers like that when there's music playing and there's a light show going on and there's somebody else loudly praying and stuff. It's harder for me to get into those moments. So that can be a struggle for me. but I have had moments since the Father's allowed me. So anyways, I was repenting of feeling so uncomfortable in those situations that I was avoiding them. I would go to churches and I would visit and I would sit and listen, and they would have their worship team, and I'd walk outside and go do a cigarette or go down the hall and look at things in the thing, because it made me feel uncomfortable and I couldn't get into it. And I wouldn't be angry or upset with anybody else. It's just I wasn't getting anything out of that. So I'm going to wait until it comes to the part where I'm going to get something out of it, the sermon, because that's what tends to get me. I like Bible studies. I like sermons. I like messages. Surprise, surprise. Therefore, instead of coming to you as a music worship leader, I'm presenting information how I tend to receive it best and what I enjoy, right? Sermons and messages and Bible studies. And I was feeling convicted on avoiding those things and not letting God work through me on those things. So I went into deep prayer that day. And as I'm praying to him about things and discussing things with him, I get shown this vision. And it was like a weird thing, because I was talking to him and praying and stuff, and then all of a sudden, like, black room, and then all of a sudden, boom, it becomes like this inside kind of like an old school castle, huge, big gray stonework. And I was in this room, and it's stonework on the ground and on the walls and beautiful archways, big, vast room, right? And before me is this huge altar table thing. It was an altar. And I wasn't TO then. Technically, I wasn't defined as a TO, right? And so, it didn't even hit me until later, even now thinking about it, that it was an altar, But so it was an altar. And I was in the vision, and I was placing big gray stones on this altar. And I only had like 4 or 5 on the altar. And it was like a slow moving vision. Like I had the first one, and I was going and I was measuring them, and it was really detailed, and I'd see the measurements and stuff. But like when I came out of that vision, I didn't remember the numbers, and I didn't think that was important, what the measurement numbers were, but rather watching what was going on. So I was measuring these stones, and they were big. I mean, big. They looked like the 1-ton stones that are used for like megalithic structures and stuff, right? That Skiba and Brian Forrester and these guys tend to go over. Big stones. And so I'd get one on the altar, and I would spend all this time making sure it was perfectly lined in the corner, flat and flush against the 2 sides, perfectly lined up. So much time in measuring it and things like this. It wasn't a reed, if any of you are wondering. It wasn't. It was some kind of like measuring tape or something. And then there was another one, and it was brought in real close so that it was tugged, nice and tight and snug. There was you couldn't fit a piece of hair or a blade of grass in between the 2, right? And then I made sure that one was perfectly set in that corner, and it was perfectly adjusted against the other one. And so this whole vision, I'm watching and I'm doing this, and I've got like, it took me forever to get one, and then a second one, and then a third one, and a fourth one. And I was getting ready to do the 5th one, where we start building on top of these big 4 1-ton stones that took me forever. There was one that would get pulled off the altar because there was scratches on the side, and it wasn't like perfectly how I thought was right. No, let me get this right. And would bring another one that looked just like it, but didn't have the scratches on there. And then, I'd get ready to put another one on there, and I go, oh no, it's not flushed together exactly precise. It needs to be. So I was doing that, right? And I get the 4, I think it was 4 stones, the 4 corners that took up this huge altar in front of me. And so I've got those done. I'm getting ready to put another one on top, start building layers, right? And this is the part of the vision where all of a sudden I'm able to zoom back a little bit and see that I'm not the only one in the room who's building on altars, right? And so I'm looking around the room, and there's all these other altars that there's individuals placing things on their altars, right? And there was even other rooms within this castle that I got to see where people are. So I looked over, and there was this one person, and they had this cone-shaped Christmas tree looking thing that went all the way up to the ceiling. And this castle room was like 20 feet plus high-rise ceiling, like huge old school castle, big room, right? Big room. And this person had that cone thing all the way up to the ceiling. And I looked at it, and it looked kind of like real colorful and had all these colors, and it was shiny and it was pretty and stuff. And then I looked at mine, and I had 4 1-ton gray stones that looked like gravel concrete, right? And I'm looking at their thing that's all the way up to the ceiling, and I felt like it wasn't a competition. It's not like we were in Hell's Kitchen TV show thing where you're doing a plate and somebody else is doing a plate and you're comparing and things like that. But I noticed somebody else. So I'm automatically, naturally, right away comparing what I've been spending my time on and looking at what somebody else is doing. And I said, oh my goodness, they're almost done. Like this person was up to the ceiling and then this other person was close to it too. And there was another one that was way up to the ceiling. And I was like, dude, I've spent all this time on just getting these 4 gray stones and they're already like almost done. And I felt like at this point, like in the vision, like I was feeling at that moment, like, oh man, what if the time's almost up and this is all I've got, you know? And so I looked and this one that I saw that was the most impressive in the vision was this big green red cone thing. And it looked kind of like a Christmas tree. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, man, you know, what a waste of time I've been doing. And look at comparing. And then the Father stopped me and said, watch. And so I'm watching and I started to see that their cone was moving a little bit like tinsel or like gift wrapping paper. If you were to blow on it, like let's say you gift wrap something that's not like a box and there's certain parts of it that can waver if you press it. It was kind of like that, right? You could see a little bit of movement. And as I'm looking at that, I'm like, whoa. And I'm like, whoa, that's not solid underneath. Because when I'm looking at it, I thought it was this huge, awesome, perfect cone thing and that it was a solid thing. And it was this bright, shiny green and this other one was bright, shiny red. And some of them had streamer things down. And this one guy I looked over and he had these like line stream tinsel thing. And they were lighting it on fire, the tinsels, and it would burn up and make cool little patterns along the top. And I was like, man, that is cool. I want to do that, right? So I even looked at my concrete stones and I went and got, because you could go to the corners and of the big room and stuff, and you could go and they had whatever supplies you wanted you could use. So I grabbed one little tinsel streamer thing. It was like this thin little thing like you would see for like you would pull out of like a pom-pom, one little thing, like on the ends of a little girl's bicycle. They have the handles and they got the little streamer tinsel things. You just yank one of those. Now imagine yanking one of those and then placing it in between 2 stones that are 1-ton stones like you'd see with like pyramid structures and things like that. And then stepping back and then lighting it and then going, yeah, no, that was really stupid and not worth it. That's what I did in the vision. I lit it and I was like, man, that was dumb. And so then I'm looking at everybody else's and I'm like, man, they're so much more impressive. And then when I saw that thing waver, the Father said, it looks impressive, but some of these are simply that, looks impressive. And I'm watching it waver and I said, hey, wait, aren't our altars supposed to be lit on fire at the end when we're done? When we go to the other room and say we're done, doesn't it get lit on fire? And the Father said, yeah. I said, what are they doing? He said, they're not building with it in their mind that it's going to be tested by fire. I hadn't read 1 Corinthians 3 at this point in my walk yet, by the way. And so I said, they don't know it's going to be tested by fire? And he said, no, they've been told, they haven't considered. And then all of a sudden, some of these altars that had impressive big cones that went all the way up to the ceiling were not so impressive anymore. And it became extremely sad. And I'm looking at it and I said, man, it looks fancy and I thought it was impressive, but it's going to be really sad when their altar gets lit and they're left with nothing. And then the Father took me to one of the other rooms in the vision. And I saw others who had stones that looked like these. Instead of the big gray stones that I had, they had stones. But they were polished. And they were beautiful. And they were colored. And I looked at that and I said, those would withstand fire. And the Father said, yeah, they will. They will withstand fire. And I said, how did they get pretty colorful gemstone things? I kept going back to the sources and finding big gray 1-ton stones. He said, that's from iron sharpening iron. That's from rock tumbling. They got polished through the edification of the body. If you want those, you have to get with the body. You have to be with the body. You have to work within the body. You have to stop sticking to just your comfort zones and start stepping out and sharing what I've given you to share and utilizing the gifts that I've given you to use towards others. You have to start bringing to the table, not just going to the community to see what you can get, because that's what I used to do. When I was first born again, I mean, I'd go and I'd preach to people about relationship with the Father that I thought were lacking that relationship. But when I went to an event, when I went to a gathering, when I went to a church and sermon stuff, the first thing in my mind and in my heart was, I can't wait to see what God's going to allow me to understand for my walk, the convictions I need and the progression I need for my walk, for my relationship with the Father, because it's me and him, me and him, me and him. I can't wait to get what I need next for me and him. And it was more seldom and less important and less significant to me to say, I can't wait to see what God's going to do through me for these other people. Because when I started thinking about myself as a vessel, I started thinking, I wouldn't even want to work through me. I know where my weaknesses lie. I know my past, which is not great. You know, God was with me my entire life, and he's worked on me my entire life, and he's been there for me my entire life, and I've talked to him and believed in him my entire life, but I didn't know him until 2014. So I lived a very ungodly life until 2014. Very ungodly life. There's a lot of things about my testimony I still haven't even come out on videos, really coming out and explaining. So my point is this. Your life is going to be judged like an altar that's going to be lit on fire. And the work that you've done is going to be tested by fire. Your beliefs, your understandings, your ministry work, your relationships with others is going to be tested by fire in judgment. And if you have the foundational stone, then you're still good. You're still saved. But look at what 1 Corinthians 3 says. And this is something that's been coming up a lot lately when people have been talking about Skiba. They said, man, the rewards he's going to have. And I agree that man had so much fruit because he was building with it in mind that it's going to be tested by fire. He wasn't building to impress. He wasn't building so that you could look over and say, man, he got that cone on his altar 20 feet high like that. That's impressive and it's shiny and beautiful. That's not what his ministry was about. Because it was about glorifying God. And what glorifies God is fireproof. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, and it shall be revealed by fire, and fire shall try what type of work it is. If any man's work abides that he built, he shall receive a reward. And if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Take heed what you build and how you build upon the altar. Your works, your beliefs are like stones on that altar. Because when you accept a belief and an understanding, a revelation, something that is significant in your walk, a belief, a principle, even if it doesn't seem significant, you end up building thereon. You're building upward. So if you put something in there on your altar that talks about, when you put something on your altar that's about pre-trib or post-trib or pre-wrath or flat earth or globe or whatever, no matter what these things are, pronunciation, names, date, calendars, things like that, these beliefs, especially if you put a lot of emphasis on that, you're building on those. If you want your works to last through the fire, then it's not just about your personal relationship with the Father. It's also about working with the body. And if you want these, instead of the big gray stones that I had in 2017, that I hope is no longer the case, I'm hoping that manifested in the spirit would be what I believe has been in my walk, that at this point, those 4 stones have some rounded out corners, that they're more smooth. They're not as rough and sharp. They're easier to come upon. They're easier to have presented because it's not new and it's been polished by other members of the body that have helped me to say, hey, you know what? You were so brash on that it was hard for me to receive the Spirit through you. And I think he was telling the truth through you, but you were going about it a way. Are you sure that you were saying things the way that God wanted you to? Or is it possible that God was giving you the idea of what to say, but you maybe stepped out of that a little bit and got loud when you shouldn't have, or whatever? Is that possible? Because that's kind of what I felt in the Spirit. It was commentary like that. I once had a pastor tell me that I handled the word of God like a sword swinging around the room like a madman. He said, man, you have truth and you have knowledge and understanding of Scripture, and you are, that sword is sharp, son. You are flying around that room, but you are swinging it like a madman. He said, you are supposed to handle truth with, it's supposed to be grace and truth and mercy. He said, man, you've got that truth part down, but you do not have that grace part down, and you are chopping people up. You're making a massacre, and then you're walking out of the room and leaving others to deal with the mess. And it hurt when he said that. And I went to the Father and I said, that can't be true. And the Father said, oh yeah. You are discerning truth really well, and you have a sharp sword, and you're doing really good on certain things, but yeah, you're not concerned about other people and how they're receiving it, and you're not concerned about having those corners smooth and not so rough and not so sharp. These are all issues I see within the body. These are all issues I've seen within myself. Everything I brought up tonight, in some manner, in some way, at some point, probably more often than once or twice, was an issue that the Father had to convict me of and talk to me and say, son, I know we talked about this puzzle piece, and I know that you're excited that you have this puzzle piece, but listen, you think it connects to this, and I never told you it connects to that. And you're cutting out other people that are trying to connect it to other pieces that you assume it doesn't connect to, because you see that it's got some, let me see if I can, it's got some swirls down here. So you're assuming it's part of this stone, but it's actually supposed to be a part of a different stone that has similar swirls. See, look at these 2 blue stones. Is it possible you could have a piece of the, man, this is hard, of the bottom? How do I, man, I'm really not, okay. Is it possible that you could have a piece of this stone and think that you have a piece of this stone and put it in a different part of the puzzle? The body needs to come together. I'm not saying put aside what you find important. I'm not saying compromise. I'm not saying question and doubt everything that you know the Father has taught you. I'm saying come to the body. Don't be a jerk. Listen to one another. Hear people out. And go to the Father. When you're in a classroom, did you ever in school compare notes and homework to other students and say, oh, so-and-so has a different note on such and such, but then at the end of the day, go to the teacher because that's the one with the red marker that actually grades your homework? That's one of the analogies I like to use for this. We're all students. Some have been students longer than others. Some are better at math and some are better at science. Some are better at social studies and others are better at history. There's always that student that's really good at physical education and not so much the other topics. But every student in the class is just that, a student in the class. And every student in the class is right about something. And every student in the class is wrong about something. You might have that A+ student that tends to get 100% on tests. And you know it because your teacher used to write it on the board. I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up, we had one of my favorite teachers used to do this, and a lot of the other teachers didn't like it. And he would write, 100%, and he would write how many got that, and it was almost always 0 or 1, right? He was known for being a very precise teacher. But I liked his teaching method. What he gave us for our homework and what he pointed out saying this will be on the test was exactly that. He didn't pull any tricks. He wasn't tricky about it. He didn't reword things. It was literally word for word. You just had to study the material and understand the material. But no matter how much you studied and understood it, it was really hard to get 100%. Well, there were students who would tend to get 100%, but they didn't get it every time. So as to say, there's members of the body that are contributing, that have a lot to contribute, your Skibas, your Chad Schaefers, etc. And they have a lot of knowledge, and they have a lot of truth and a lot of understanding, and they bring a lot of fruit to the table. But that doesn't mean that they have everything 100% right. That doesn't mean that you don't have something to offer that they might need to hear. Even though they've been in it, in the classroom for decades, and maybe you're brand new, maybe you're a first-year student. Compare notes with other students. Go to the teacher who has the red marker. Go to the actual capital R rabbi who actually grades your work at the end of the day. It's okay to have tutors. It's okay to have study groups. But the teacher is the one that grades. Okay, I'm going to end it on that note. We didn't get to say everything that I wanted to say, but somehow this video actually ended up being longer than the other one. I'm sorry, guys. I hope that the Spirit of God used me tonight to help you with your walk. And I hope you gained something from this. And if not something new, a reminder that was needed. A polishing of the stones a little bit. That is the end of tonight. I look forward to hearing your feedback.
Yeah. He's alive. It's really just that simple, man. Draw nigh to God, man. Yeah. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh unto you.